and they use rumbles in a greeting context as well. So when two individuals who are bonded to each other approach one another after some period of separation, they make these greeting rumbles. In African elephants, at least, especially African savanna elephants, it's usually associated with like a more elaborate behavioral display where they're being really exuberant. They make other highly emotional calls too. They kind of spin around. They urinate, defecate. There's a lot of excitement, and then they also make them in what are sometimes called little greeting contexts, where two individuals who have been in the same group all day, but maybe one of them just approaches the other to within touching distance, and then they'll make a rumble as well, but it's more subdued than these like louder, exuberant greeting
Hmm.
displays. They also mothers and allo mothers, so non like females other than the mother who help take care of a calf, they'll produce rumbles called coo rumbles to the calf in kind of two different contexts. One is when they're comforting the calf after the calf has expressed distress about something, and the other is where they're basically touching or nursing the calf in a calm context with no apparent distress. And those two types of rumbles, like it doesn't seem like they're acoustically distinct from each other, so we just call them a single type coo rumbles. And so they're kind of like I think in my paper I actually called them caregiving rumbles to give them a more functional description. But yeah, I think those are kind of some of the more common categories.
Hmm. Hmm. And so, yeah, I mean, these are, a lot of social use here, clearly. And some of them, start to imply that it's not just sort of general vocalizations directed towards everyone. Some of these could be personal and even individual.
Right.
And so, where does this start to bleed into some of the research you've done on whether or not they're calling each other by unique names?
Yeah. So what we did basically is focused on rumbles where we were able to identify the individual who made the call, and also where we were able to identify a single individual recipient of the call. So sometimes elephants will make a rumble and everybody in the group responds. But sometimes they'll make a rumble and only one specific individual responds. And sometimes they'll make a rumble in a context where it's clear that they're only communicating to a specific individual. So, for example, with greeting rumbles, it's very easy. If it's especially little greeting rumbles where it's just two individuals, one individual approaches another, somebody makes a call, and then the other individual responds. It's very obvious there's a caller, there's a receiver. Same thing with the coo rumbles to calves, like the caregivers making the call and the intended recipient is obviously the calf because it's
Hmm.
just those two individuals interacting.
Hmm.
With contact rumbles, it's a little bit more challenging
Right.
because you can't be in two places at once, and usually the receiver is outside of the line of sight of the caller. But sometimes we were able to figure out that contact call was directed to one specific individual. Typically, this was in a situation where, for example, we had been following the group all day, so we knew everybody who was in the group that day, and everybody except for one individual continued on. One individual was lagging behind the group, and then somebody in the main body of the group would make a contact call, often while facing in the direction of the individual who was lagging. So we could, in that situation, we could reasonably infer that it was a contact call directed to that one specific individual.
Hmm. Hmm.
So basically, we gathered all of these calls where we were confident that they were addressed to just one individual and we
Hmm.
knew who that individual
Yeah.
was. And then we measured a bunch of features of the acoustic properties of these calls, and then we tried to use a random forest model, like a type of
Yeah.
machine
Yeah.
learning classifier, to assign those calls to to basically
Yeah.
predict who a call was addressed
Yeah.
to just
So
from the acoustic properties of that call.
yeah, so at this point, let's do two things. So one, in essence, once you get to this point, you've identified these contexts in which it's quite clear that there's communication from an individual to another individual, even though
Right.
this is like often in a group context. So you've got contextual factors that are helping you discern when you can sort of isolate,
Mhm.
one-on-one conversations, so to speak. Um, and the and so at that point, you're basically saying, okay, are they saying, "Hey, Mickey, like, come, you're falling behind, keep up," or are they just going, "Hey, hey," like, and so now you've got to distinguish if they're making this sort of general sound directed at an individual, excuse me, at an individual versus
Mhm.
using a sound that is only directed at that individual that would never be used to make the same kind of call to someone else.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was the big question, right? So my my postdoctoral supervisor and one of my collaborators had been studying it. I mean, they've been studying elephants for decades.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so over the course of their experience with elephants, they had observed a lot of situations where elephants were vocalizing, and it seemed like just one individual responded. But we didn't know for sure if the calls had some information in them that identified a specific intended
Mm-hmm.
recipient, or if in those instances where just one individual responds, it was just because that was the only individual who felt like responding in that
Right.
particular
Right.
instance.
Right.
So we needed to know if these calls actually contain some information that is specific to the
Mm-hmm.
intended receiver of the
Yeah.
call.
And before getting to some of the punchline here, the other thing I wanted to bring up at this point was how are you making these measurements? You're out in the field
Mhm.
following elephants. How close are you to the elephants? How are you literally making the acoustic measurements? How is all of this being measured?
Yeah, so the nice thing about working with the population of elephants that I work with, which is in Samburu and Buffalo Springs National Reserves in northern Kenya, is that this population has been studied for decades. So the elephants are very habituated to researchers in a vehicle, and we can drive up pretty close to them. So I was making these recordings from, anywhere from like 25 to 5 meters away. I
Hmm.
tried to be at least 20, like no more than 20 meters from the elephants to get good quality audio. And they were fine with that. Like they just kind of treat you like a feature of the environment.
Hmm.
And so we would just follow them around all day until they went into a place where we couldn't access with the vehicle. And